So today's lecture is about geological time and the history of Earth. This is one of my favorite subjects, and let's dive right into it. So how do we learn about ancient life? You guys have probably heard the terms of biological evolution, geological time, deep time, things taking billions or millions of years. But how do we understand the processes of biology on Earth? And how do we learn about ancient life? Well, one of the first things that we do is we consult with paleontologists. Paleontologists are scientists who study the fossils that are in rocks to reconstruct the history of life. A fossil is simply a trace or an imprint of a living thing or their body, in the case of shells and things like that, that is preserved by geological processes. These geological processes usually require very quick burial in a place that doesn't have a lot of oxygen. That way the body fossil or the trace can be quickly preserved and not disturbed after deposition. That's very important. So this is how we get things like 30-million-year-old flies that are encased in amber. We also have evidence of different invertebrates. We don't have their bodies preserved, but instead we have the imprints of their bodies preserved. And what's important is that this sediment was probably muddy, right? So it could really take in those different folds and crevices of the body of the fossil. This is also how we have mammoths found in permafrost, which actually, unfortunately, today is more and more easy to find because we're thawing permafrost at a very rapid rate, especially in the northern latitudes. But that is a discussion for another time. Some of the oldest fossils date back to about 3.5 billion years ago. These are fossils of single-celled organisms, and these are called stromatolites. These stromatolites here, these are photographs of stromatolites that are aged at 3.5 billion years old, located in Western Australia during the time period of the Archean. So these are Archean rocks of 3.5 billion years in age, located in Western Australia. And this fossil type is a stromatolite composed mainly of cyanobacterial microbial mats. Very cool stuff. This is like my favorite part of geobiology, is understanding origins of life and how life evolved on this planet. But what's interesting is instead of these 3.5 billion year old rocks representing the first evidence of life, we actually have geochemical evidence that pushes that date back to about 3.8 billion years. So not by much, but still that is a huge expanse of time. We're talking about billions of years here. So the origins of life on Earth is said to be about 3.8 billion years based off of geochemical evidence. This has to do with isotopic ratios associated with specific microbial metabolisms. So what specifically can we learn about fossils? Well, I used the word, I think, fossil record in the last slide. So all of the fossils that have been discovered worldwide are considered to be part of the fossil record of Earth. Examining the fossil record helps scientists identify when different species lived and died on this planet. So the record here is composed of different rock types that are stacked upon each other, each containing different types of fossils. And there are two distinct ways to describe the age of fossils. The first is called relative dating. Relative dating is useful because of the law of superposition. This is simply stating that older rocks are below newer rocks. So here in our example on the right, the oldest rocks are going to be found on the bottom. The newest rocks are going to be found on the top, unless there's some sort of disturbance like a mountain building event that will fold and deform the rocks, putting it backwards basically. You can think of the law of superposition in your everyday lives. I mean, just taking a look at the desk that I'm sitting at, the papers that I received last week, they're sitting on the bottom-most portion of my desk. And then the papers that I just got this morning to read and look at, those are stacked on top of the papers that came to my desk last week. So even just in my living space around me, I can see examples of the law of superposition. So this determines whether a fossil formed before or after another fossil formed. And newer fossils are found in layers of rock that are above older fossils. Again, unless there's some sort of disconforming activity or process like a mountain building event. In contrast to relative dating, we also have absolute dating measurements. These are estimates of the exact age of a fossil in years. So relative dating says older or newer, so it's more of a qualitative measurement, whereas absolute dating puts a number to it. It assigns a numeric value in years. So estimations are based on information from radioactive elements in certain rocks near the fossil. A specific example of a type of radioactive element that you are probably most familiar with is carbon-14. Carbon-14 dating is really good for organic material that hasn't been around for too long. It has a half-life of 5,730 years. If you're interested in learning more about carbon dating and specifically how C14 is generated in the Earth's atmosphere, I'm going to be placing some Khan Academy supplemental videos on the Blackboard. So these are the two ways that paleontologists and scientists are able to date fossils. So the question is, what can relative dating and absolute dating tell us about these different fossils? Well, first, the fossil record gives evidence of many of the different organisms that have lived during Earth's history. One of my favorite examples of this life in Earth history is watching the changes in populations preserved in fossils over many generations and across different continents on Earth. So you may or may not have heard of this type of organism called a trilobite. Trilobites thrived on Earth for about 270 million years before going extinct at the end Permian mass extinction. So these are related most closely to horseshoe crabs that you probably know, but they are in the arthropod family. So they're related to bugs, basically. And these trilobites, they have lots and lots of different forms, different shapes, different sizes, and the largest collection that we have access to here in the United States is located at the Smithsonian. It's called the Hazen Collection of Trilobites. It contains over 1,000 species and 2,000 distinct specimens, mostly collected by a researcher named Dr. Robert Hazen. Robert Hazen was my postdoc advisor. He's a very interesting man with lots of different scientific interests, but he globetrotted for decades finding and collecting these very rare trilobite specimens. And he very graciously donated all of these to the Smithsonian. And you can take a look at all of those specimens if you physically go to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., or there's also images here on the website that he has. So some species are present in the fossil record for a short period of time, while others can survive a long period of time without much change. So that's just taking a look and comparing the different morphologies or the body types of organisms throughout different rocks of different ages. We can track the fossil record of distinct lineages of organisms, both invertebrates without a backbone and vertebrates, by looking at fossils of different ages and different rocks. So here we have the fossil sequence of different animal phyla. Phylum is one of the broadest categories of life, and we'll talk about systematics later on. But here we just have an example as you march through time. So going from older rocks here in the Precambrian all the way through today, we have the emergence of distinct groups going from shelled vertebrates as some of the oldest fossils on Earth through fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, and then man. So we can't talk about life on Earth without talking about extinctions of that life on Earth. An extinction happens when every individual of a species dies. So once the last creature of a specific group or species once that last creature dies, the whole species has gone extinct. And a mass extinction occurs when a large number of species go extinct during a relatively short amount of time. Now, we always have to bear in mind when we're talking about time on a geological sense, a relatively short amount of time could represent a couple million years. So it's not like a blink of an eye and everything's dead. Some of these processes take a lot of time to develop a worldwide catastrophe. Gradual environmental changes and catastrophic events, such as an impact of an asteroid, can cause mass extinctions. So here's where we get to the concept of time and how extinctions feed into that. So because we will have a catastrophic event, say that there's a giant asteroid that hits Earth, of course, most of the life that's in that general region here is going to be smashed to bits and destroyed. But there are consequences that the entire Earth will feel as an impact of this large crater that was developed. Things like lots of water vapor in the atmosphere, maybe it's very, very cloudy, and so the sun can't penetrate and provide light for photosynthesizers, then the life that feeds off of plants can't get their energy, and so there's this cascade of events that occur that are precipitated by one big, massive event. So extinctions and mass extinctions are documented in the fossil record. Fossils that were common in certain rock layers may decrease in frequency and may eventually just disappear altogether. That's how we know an extinction event occurred. It's just the organism was there, they were there, and we get to a rock section where they disappear completely. That's how we know that they went extinct. Evidence in the fossil record helps scientists form hypotheses about how and when species went extinct. So in specific rock layers, for example, you'll have the fossils, and then perhaps you have a volcanic ash layer that's right underneath or right above those fossils. That would tell you that there was a large volcanic eruption that occurred around the same time where those organisms went extinct. Fossil emergence in the fossil record suggests when and how ecological space opened up to allow the emergence and diversification of different lineages. And my favorite example of this is the diversification of mammals after the extinction of dinosaurs. So dinosaurs were the head honcho during the period in which they lived. And then once they went extinct, this opened up an ecospace, an ecological niche that the mammals could then thrive in. So while we lost the dinosaurs, we did gain a diverse array of different mammal species. So I've used this term a lot, geological time. What is geological time? We can say millions and billions of years, but really what does this mean? So the geological time scale is the standard method used to divide Earth's 4.6 billion year history into manageable parts, something that we can have a common language of understanding about. If I say the Proterozoic, people know what period of Earth's history that I'm talking about. Here on the right is the geological column or the geological time scale that has been put out by the Geological Society of America. As you'll notice, this is version 5. Paleontologists tend to find evidence all the time that might shift these dates around just a little bit. So paleontologists adjust and add details to the geological timescale when they find new evidence for a date to be shifted. That's why this is version number 5. And the early history of Earth has been largely poorly understood compared to the rest of history, mainly because rocks and fossils of this time span are rare. And that's because of plate tectonics. We're constantly recycling the Earth's crust and the rocks that are around us. And so there are very few rocks that exist on our planet that date back to the Archean eon here, which represents the oldest period of Earth's history. There are boundaries between geological time intervals that correspond to significant changes in Earth's history. This makes it easy for us to decide what is Cambrian versus Precambrian, Tertiary versus Cretaceous. And most of this evidence comes from fossils. So we rely heavily on the fossil record to determine these different intervals of geological time. And some major boundaries are defined by those mass extinctions that I was talking about, or significant changes in the number of species. Some boundaries are defined by major changes in Earth's surface or climate. So what was the oxygen in the atmosphere like? What was that surface planetary redox state really like? Was it a glacial period where everything was covered by ice and snow? Or was it what we call an interglacial, where that snow and ice melt, there aren't as many glaciers, and that's what we're living through right now, is an interglacial period. So this brings us to the question, how is this geological column or the geological timescale organized? And so you've probably heard these words before, period and era and eon, but let's just learn how those are nested inside of each other to be organized in the way that they are. So the largest divisions of the geological timescale are called eons. These eons here, like the Phanerozoic, are then broken up into different eras, like the Cenozoic. Eras are then characterized by the type of organism that was present during that time and dominated the Earth. So taking a look at the previous slide, that'll put you into perspective of why we call eras what we do. But eras are broken up into periods. So for example, we have the Cenozoic era broken up into the Tertiary period. Also, we have the Quaternary period. And those periods are then divided into epochs. I think that's how geologists say it. I want to say epochs, but it's epochs. So in the Tertiary period, for example, we have also the Neogene and the Paleogene period, which is a strange example. But geologists like to rename things all of the time. So we'll just leave it to them. But in the Paleogene period, we also have the Oligocene epoch, the Eocene epoch, and the Paleocene epoch. So as biology students, I do not anticipate that you will memorize the geological column and how it's all organized in terms of specific names, but I would like you to recognize the divisions of eons, eras, periods, and epochs. So the 4 major divisions that make up Earth's history are the Precambrian, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And so while I'm not going to expect you to remember what period is in what epoch, I do want you, or what epoch is in what period, I do want you to recognize the main characteristics of each of these eras that are on this slide. These are very important times in biological Earth history. So first we're going to talk about the Precambrian. Precambrian simply means before the Cambrian. This is the oldest period of Earth's history. Precambrian time started about 4.6 billion years ago when the Earth first formed, and it's made up of the first 3 eons of Earth's history. That represents 4 billion years. That is a whole lot of time. And most of life was actually pretty simple during the Precambrian time. Bacteria and archaea represented the largest portion of Earth. It was the representative type of life on Earth. These are single-celled organisms without a nucleus. They were the dominant form. Now, you probably are more familiar with the term of prokaryote, which means before the nucleus. But scientists more and more are straying away from using the term prokaryote because it's not as clear-cut and defined as most scientists would like. So instead of the word prokaryote, I'm going to always use the terms bacteria and archaea, because bacteria and archaea can sometimes be very, very different from each other, and I don't want to conflate the two and confuse you. So bacteria and archaea, two separate domains of life, but both of them are single-celled and they have no nucleus. Here's an image of what these bacteria or archaea look like under the microscope, and then here's a lovely artist depiction of what Precambrian time would have looked like. So if you remember, at the beginning of our slideshow, I showed you images of these fossils called stromatolites, which represent the earliest form of fossil on Earth, about 3.5 billion years ago. So this is the setting in which you would have found stromatolites. These are mats of cyanobacterial communities. They're photosynthetic bacteria, and they form these colonies of mats that eventually become lithified or turned into rock that we can then find for examination later. So they are found in these warm, shallow ponds, and this is just an artist's depiction of what Precambrian time would have looked like. So these organisms, they lived in the ocean, and they're the earliest life forms, and guess what? We didn't have oxygen in the atmosphere. So they actually lived and breathed without oxygen around. They used other chemicals like sulfur and carbon dioxide. They ate and generated methane. So these are microbial metabolisms that are just some really weird stuff. And that's why astrobiologists, when they're interested in examining life on other planets and the potential for life on Mars, for example, they look to ancient analogs, life that lived in the earliest periods of Earth's history, to understand the type of life that would have been sustained by these environments. We can also talk about the fossil evidence during the Precambrian. This fossil evidence suggests that the prokaryote, or the bacteria named cyanobacteria, appeared around 3.5 billion years ago. Now this falls back to fossil evidence. We call these fossils microfossils because they are in fact micro. And this suggests again that these lineages appeared about 3.5 billion years ago. And if you aren't already aware about cyanobacteria, cyanobacteria use sunlight to make their own food. Cyano means blue-green, and for a long time, people referred to cyanobacteria as blue-green algae. So if you're reading papers about cyanobacteria or articles about them, way back when, people used to refer to them as blue-green algae. But these cyanobacteria use sunlight to make their own food, and this process releases oxygen. This is extremely important when we're talking about geobiological interactions in the early Earth, because most of the atmosphere was not oxygenated. Oxygen really only existed in these oxygen oases that were common in the Archean, but not everywhere. So when we look at these, at the concentration or the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, most of the oxygen in our atmosphere remained at very, very low concentrations early in Earth history, until what we call the Great Oxidation Event, which took place about 2.4 billion years ago. This is when we saw dramatic increases in the oxygen concentration on Earth's surface. This is likely most attributable to the rise of cyanobacteria. There are other hypotheses that go around having to do with changes in plate tectonics and volcanism, but by and large, scientists do attribute a lot of this oxygen accumulation in the atmosphere to the rise of the cyanobacteria that through their metabolism release this oxygen. So eventually oxygen built up enough in the air to form the ozone layer. This ozone layer helps to protect all of life on Earth's surface from damaging UV radiation. It's concentrated in the upper atmosphere. And again, this is called the Great Oxidation Event. Now, this increased oxygen also led to something really important for life on Earth. It allowed the evolution of new species that used oxygen to live and to breathe. Most of us, when we're thinking about breathing, we think about inhaling oxygen. That's what we do, and that's what a lot of life on this planet does. But before the Great Oxidation Event, that was not a very common metabolism. So after about 1 billion years, new types of organisms evolved. We call these organisms eukaryotes. They have a nucleus and other complex structures. Now, the word eukaryote means true nucleus. Karyon, or Karyon, means kernel or shell. So true shell is where that name comes from. So we have the rise of the eukaryotes, which include things like protists and our plants, including our fungi, and most commonly what we tend to think of as eukaryotic animals. And again, that is to contrast the eukaryote, the true nucleus-bearing organisms, to the prokaryotes that we know as archaea and bacteria. So later on, these eukaryotic organisms, they then develop this characteristic of multicellularity. So instead of unicellular being made up of only one cell, they then develop to be multicellular, made up of more than one cell. And next week, we'll get to talk about the different hypotheses surrounding the rise of multicellularity. It's actually very interesting stuff. So we can really appreciate that for most of early Earth and life on early Earth, oxygen was toxic. And so when oxygen started building up in the atmosphere, we also have to conclude that many of the organisms that were thriving on early Earth actually went extinct. Again, these are microbial lineages. They are unicellular organisms. We have a strong fossil record of this Precambrian life because microscopic organisms do not really preserve well in the rock record. We do have some extremely rare instances of beautifully preserved microorganisms. For example, this is an example of Gripania. The Gripania fossil here is considered to be one of the first multicellular microfossils. But beyond this and some cyanobacterial microfossils, it's a pretty rare find. So next we can talk about the Paleozoic era. This is also called the era of marine life. The Paleozoic era began about 542 million years ago, right after the Precambrian. So this is when we get into the Cambrian time period. Rocks from this era are rich in fossils, and these fossils now are animals, including sponges, corals, snails, and trilobites. This is also the time known as the Cambrian explosion, and mostly because of the types of animals that evolved. So before, in the Precambrian, the main dominant form of life were microscopic organisms, and they don't have a lot of good material that can fossilize and be robust enough to be discovered by scientists millions or billions of years later. By contrast, the Cambrian explosion is called this because it seems that we have just this explosion of life in the fossil record marking this time. But it's really only because the organisms that developed during this time had shelly pieces, had pieces of themselves that were easily preserved. They were big enough to have some sort of trace left behind in the sediment environment. So really it's sort of a preservation bias that we come to know the Cambrian explosion. We have the development of fish and sharks during this time. They are some of the earliest animals with vertebrae or backbones that we know about. We also have a lot that happened during this Paleozoic era, and that's because there are 6 periods within this one era. So this is when we have the rise of non-vascular plants first. Non-vascular plants do not have root systems to draw up water into their leaves. But then we do develop vascular plants, fungi, and air-breathing animals. All of this life colonized land during the Paleozoic era. We have land dwellers that developed adaptations that allow them to survive in a drier environment. These are things like waxy cuticles that protect plants from drying out or desiccating. They came from ancestors who were fully submerged in water, and now to colonize land, it's a much drier, harsher environment. They had to develop and evolve these adaptations that allowed them to survive in such an environment. We also have the evolution of crawling insects. These are among the first animals to live on land, followed by large salamander-like animals. So when we talk about the transition from living in the water to living on land, we have to talk about this transition fossil called Tiktaalik. You may have seen images of Tiktaalik before, but this is one of the prime key examples of a transition fossil that showed us the transition between a fish and a true tetrapod, something that walks with 4 limbs on land. So this is the transition fossil between primitive fish and land-dwelling tetrapods, aka the fishapod. So a tetrapod simply means 4 feet. And so we need to start thinking about what adaptations would have allowed organisms to migrate from oceans to the land. If we look at this Tiktaalik fossil, it has a number of key characteristics. So first, it has sturdy interior bones with imbricated ribs. That simply means evenly spaced ribs. It has limbs for support because it doesn't have the free floating environment of the water to keep it erect and upright. It needs some sort of skeletal structure and muscles to support itself. It has eyes on the top of its flat head, and it has a true functional neck. Primitive fishes do not have a neck, and so seeing this type of morphology in the head area is a key way to know that it's a transition from a primitive fish to a true tetrapod. Most interestingly, this organism also has both gills and lungs. So it could survive and perhaps live and had a bimodal type of lifestyle in the water and on land as well. So Tiktaalik is technically a fish, and it's from the late Devonian period, which was about 375 million years ago. This fossil was discovered by Dr. Neil Shubin and his team in the Canadian Arctic. And there's a TED Ed lesson that you should listen to and answer the questions about that describes how Neil Shubin and his team were able to make the hypothesis that they would find this type of fossil in those types of rocks. So we can take a look at other things that define the Paleozoic era. We have the Permian mass extinction that took place at the end of the Paleozoic era. This is known as the largest mass extinction. It occurred about 250 million years ago. We can tell that there was perhaps a large volcanic eruption that took place because there's volcanic ash layers in the rocks of this age. And you can clearly see the boundary between the Permian here at the end of the Paleozoic and the beginning of the Mesozoic here with the Triassic. So by 250 million years ago, as many as 96% of marine species became extinct. That's a whole lot. That's nearly all of marine life went extinct in the matter of geological seconds. But again, when we're talking about geological time, it's always good to keep in mind that this is a gradual process. The mass extinction wiped out entire groups of marine organisms, and oceans were completely changed. You're talking about temperature, you're talking about water chemistry, and so many species could not adapt or cope or evolve fast enough to escape becoming extinct. But of course, time marches on, and so after the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, we have the Mesozoic era. So the Mesozoic era is a time that reptiles survived and evolved into many different species. Dinosaurs are the most well-known reptiles that evolved during the Mesozoic era. And after the dinosaurs, we have the first birds and mammals that appeared. And evolutionarily, when we're talking about ancestors of birds, it is now it's the consensus that birds are the descendants of dinosaurs. So when people say that dinosaurs went extinct, you could always just point to a bird and say, no, they're not extinct. There's a dinosaur right there. And most important plants of this era were conifers or cone-bearing plants, which formed large forests. And we also got some flowering plants at this time too. So we didn't have flowers until pretty late on into the development of plants. Evidence showed that Earth experienced an asteroid strike around the Mesozoic era, and this caused a whole bunch of giant dust clouds and worldwide fires, which again provided a very stark and harsh environment in which organisms had to either adapt or die off. And so without sunlight blocked off by the dust, many plants would have died. And again, that causes this cascade of effects that affect everything along the food chain. So without plants, plant-eating dinosaurs, they would have died. They would have succumbed to the pressure of not having enough food. And of course, meat-eating dinosaurs that ate other dinosaurs, they wouldn't have their food source either. So that defines the Mesozoic era. The Cenozoic era is even closer to our time period now, and this is when we start getting into woolly mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers and those big, woolly, furry creatures that we associate with when we're talking about fossils. This is pretty much what everybody's mind goes to, the big woolly mammoth. And so during the Cenozoic era, many mammals were dominating. This began about 65 million years ago, and it continues today. So as I mentioned previously in the lecture, after the fall of the dinosaurs, this really allowed an ecospace to open up and allow mammals to take over. Humans also appeared during this era, during the Cenozoic. And what's very, very interesting is the climate changed many times during the Cenozoic. Organisms, they had to, in order to adapt and survive, migrate closer to the equator so they can remain warmer, and they adapted to the cold, or they just became extinct because they could not keep up with the external pressures of their environment. When we talk about the Cenozoic era, we also have to talk about the development and evolution of primates. So primates are a group of mammals that includes the humans, apes, and the monkeys. Primates as a group have eyes that are in the front of their head, and most primates have 5 flexible fingers, one of which is an opposable thumb. So that's one of the key characteristics of the primate group. Primates' ancestors were probably nocturnal, mouse-like mammals, and millions of years after the dinosaurs died out, primates with larger brains appeared. As early humans faced new environmental challenges, they evolved bigger bodies. They also evolved larger and more complex brains. These large complex brains can process and store a lot of information. And that was a huge advantage to early humans in their social interactions, as well as their encounters in unfamiliar habitats. These unfamiliar habitats were always changing because of all of the climate changes that were occurring in the environment. And so over the course of human evolution, human brain size tripled. what's interesting is that the modern human brain is the largest and most complex of any living primate.